Hello and salutations, my fellow philosophers. Welcome back to the Philos-Hippie Podcast, where we explore the intersection of spirituality and philosophy and how we can lead more holistic and meaningful secular lives. Today's episode of the podcast is going to attempt to spread some lighthearted frivolity to the world because, in case you hadn't noticed, we currently live in quite serious times. Climate change is a complete catastrophe that is wrecking our environment. We are currently experiencing a hard shift to the alt-right in the Overton window all across the world as fascism slowly gains influence. Billions of people are oppressed under the brutal conditions of late-stage capitalism worldwide. And to top it all off, we are experiencing one of the worst mental health crises in history, with nihilism lurking its dark shadow beneath anything we deem valuable and meaningful. This all makes me wonder though, could all these problems be due to the fact that we simply take life too seriously? I'm not saying that we should be lackadaisical about all these issues, but I do wonder if we are approaching these problems with the wrong, stifling attitude. For example, when we think about reducing our consumption and slowing down production in order to combat climate change, we often approach it as if it's some solemn Kantian duty that we must take upon ourselves, that we must sacrifice much in order to preserve the human race. The famous adage, all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy, isn't applicable solely to individuals, but also society at large. While we will have to make sacrifices to make the world a better place, I believe that we can do it in a way that doesn't have to sacrifice our inner child. I will talk more about what an inner child means exactly later in this episode, but for now, I think the only way we can go about making the world a better place is if we approach life as one ceaseless infinite game we all take part in, and that the goal of the game is to simply keep it going so that we can play endlessly forever and ever. Because what good is a game if it simply ends? We should strive to fully engage ourselves in the game of life and to let it last as long as possible. The apocalyptic mystic Jesus Christ of Nazareth once said, "Let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these," in Matthew 19:14. This is because children are not weighed down upon by the burdens of society, and the world is limitless beyond reproach for them because all of life is play. Without fully being able to flesh out the idea of what God is, children are the ultimate nihilist in the active sense without realizing it. They simply do not care about the throes of nihilism because they are living lives of the mind through their imagination, and they act out their wildest fantasies in a sandbox in which the entire world is a sea of endless possibilities. Children aren't worried about finding purpose and meaning to their lives like adults because they are more concerned about playing and then wallowing in existential despair. My claim in this episode of the podcast is to suggest that society as a whole needs a shift in attitude towards one of playful optimism as an antidote to the kind of nihilism we see today. And we can do this by tracing the element of play throughout history in order to better understand how it appears at the forefront of all culture, so that we can see how essential and natural play is to the progress of civilization. And last but not least, learning how one can personally recreate themselves through the act of recreation. Now, to begin our analysis of play, I want to begin by looking at one of the foundational texts of game theory in the 20th century. Johan Huizinga begins his book Homo Ludens, A Study of the Play Element in Culture, by saying that, quote, civilization arises and unfolds in and as play, end quote. And he boldly asserts that our species, Homo sapiens, should get a name rebrand, and that we should be called Homo Ludens, not man the wise, but rather man the playful. He argues that play is older than culture, and is the wellspring out of which all societal progress arises out of. The reason play precedes culture is because animals and humans play with each other, and it's a simple biological phenomenon that is innate in us all. But it is also much, much more than that. Huizinga writes that, quote, civilization is, in its earliest phases, played. It has not come from play like a babe detaching itself from the womb. It arises in and as play, and never leaves it, end quote. Cultural and societal growth was developed in the form of play, and in so doing, shaped language, art, law, religion, and so much more. To understand how this is so with some examples, we should properly define play before proceeding. According to Huizinga, the first main characteristic of play is that it is done at leisure, during free time. It is essentially free. It is this freedom, this stepping outside ordinary life, that gives play its peculiar quality. A second characteristic is closely connected with this, namely that play is not ordinary or real life. It is rather stepping out of a real life into a temporary sphere of activity with a disposition all of its own. Every child knows perfectly well that he is only pretending, or that it was only for fun, when they imagine themselves as pirates trying to steal their precious booty, or just simply playing cops and robbers and playing pretend. Play is distinct from ordinary life, both as to locality and duration. This is the third main characteristic of play. Its secludedness, its limitedness. It is played out within certain limits of time and place. If the ball is thrown off field or doesn't score before the buzzer, the action has no effect because it has broken the rules of the game. A game contains its own course and meaning. Inside the playground, an absolute and peculiar order reigns. And here we come across another very positive feature of play. It creates order. It is order. Into an imperfect world and into the confusion of life, it brings a temporary and limited perfection. Play demands order, absolute and supreme. The smallest deviation from it spoils the game, robs it of its character, and makes it worthless. Play also has a tendency to be beautiful. It may be that this aesthetic factor is identical with the impulse to create orderly form, which animates play in all its aspects. Last but not least, play possesses a disinterested character to it, for the purposes it serves are external to immediate material interest. For example, when one isn't forced to live in a perpetual state of survival, they are able to forego their material concerns and are fully capable of losing themselves in the act of play. Most people simply do not care what they are having for dinner that night if they are fully entranced, fully immersed in the intense Dungeons and Dragons campaign, for example. So, to sum up Huizinga, play is performed during leisure time, when it's detached from real life while still adhering itself to temporal space that is contained within a sacred circle or playground, which requires some cohesion of aesthetic order. Any good game has rules and boundaries that are played during recess or free time, and the game itself becomes satisfying to watch and partake because of its limitedness. It also has to be voluntary, because if you're forced to play, well, that simply takes all the fun out of it and deprives one of their natural autonomy. A crucial element of what makes play fun is that it is engaged in for its own sake, outside the realm of survival. However, this concept of play isn't restricted solely to games and sports like only one may first imagine. It also applies to ritual, religion, law, war, poetry, art, knowledge, philosophy, and civilization itself. Perhaps the clearest example of how play arises in culture naturally is through war. Now, I am no advocate of war. I think war should personally be abolished off the face of the earth, but I can at least appreciate how war has evolved throughout history and how modern warfare has grown to be absolutely despicable due to its even more barbarous practices than in the past. Ancient and medieval warfare at least had rules, rituals, and equal competition. War always took place within established boundaries and gave it structure and meaning. The goal wasn't complete extermination of the other enemy, but rather glory for warriors in the Iliad, or chivalric honor for knights in the medieval era. All these soldiers engaged in war willingly in order to serve their nation or tribe, and also aesthetically and playfully represented their home through colorful, intricately patterned shields or wearing heraldic crests. You may be asking now how war can be playful when it's often viewed in the utmost serious nature, since it straddles the line between life and death. This is because another central aspect to play is its relationship to seriousness. According to Huizinga, quote, culture lives in the tension between play and seriousness, end quote. Play contains itself in the world by restricting itself to self-imposed boundaries. But once one crosses the battlefield, the courtroom, the stage, the ritual circle, the playground, one must adhere to its made-up rules with the utmost seriousness. For example, if one is trying to solve a riddle but asks Google for help, it completely spoils the game and takes the fun out of it. Or if one enters the courtroom and doesn't address the judge as your honor, one will face severe consequences for betraying the tradition. War is playful in form because it is a self contained world of rules and traditions that bestows the winner with honor, prestige, or territory, and is carried out with the utmost seriousness within its confines. However, Huizinga points out how the world wars of the 20th century completely abandoned the play element by trying to completely eradicate the enemy through total war and scorched earth tactics, which has only created countless destruction without the redemption of meaning. All the honor and rules that war was once adhered to were completely neglected in pursuit of complete utilitarian dominance. Modern war becomes meaningless violence, not ritualized contest. It is when one side takes the game too seriously that the playful element disappears. This may be a bit of a trivial example when you scale it down from the gravity of war, but there's a reason why people hate playing games with tryhards that care nothing more than victory. When gamers are cheating and sweating from being hyper competitive on Fortnite or Call of Duty, it takes all the fun out of it. World War One was such a shock for everyone around the world because the rules of the game had been fundamentally changed when the Germans introduced the machine gun and mustard gas in order to get rid of any competition. Seriousness without play results in rigid mechanization and cultural death, whether it be in war or Call of Duty. This tension between seriousness and play is crucial for the development of culture. It's a fine dance of opposites that results in the genesis of rich cultural progress. For example, the Brahms competed in, please excuse my pronunciation, Jatavidya, or the knowledge of the origins. Poems were composed and performed only in riddle form, which sought to answer the nature of being and the unknowable. Huizinga said that the riddle was, quote, originally a sacred game, and as such, it cut clean across any possible distinction between play and seriousness. It was both at once, a ritual element of the highest importance, and yet essentially a game. As civilization develops, the riddle branches out in two directions: mystic philosophy on the one hand, and recreation on the other. But in this development, we must not think of seriousness as degenerating into play, or play rising to the level of seriousness. It is rather that civilization gradually brings about a certain division between two modes of mental life, which we distinguish as play and seriousness respectively, but which originally formed a continuous mental medium wherein that civilization arose. End quote. These riddles straddled the line between lighthearted poetry and profound wisdom. It brought forth the birth of Eastern philosophy by people attempting to answer them in playful contests and playful riddles. It seems perfectly natural that it arose in this way because many children's incessant questions that drive parents mad often are questions about how the world works. It is out of this incessant childlike curiosity about the philosophical nature of existence that the fountainhead of human knowledge and wisdom arose out of. Huizinga was writing Homo Ludens during the rapid rise of fascism in the late 1930s. Huizinga looked around himself as he thought the foundations of democratic Europe were crumbling before himself, and he asked himself, has modern civilization lost the true spirit of play? He argues that the qualities of play, such as freedom, meaning, aesthetic, and intrinsic motivation, are disappearing from the social fabric and being replaced by profit, spectacle, and propaganda. Festivities, theatrical plays, the systems that operate everyday life are replaced by activities by what Huizinga calls pseudo play, which looks like play but are no longer truly free. Commercialized sports and the acting industry erases the intrinsically motivating factor that makes play genuine by incentivizing people with $1 million contracts. When mass media turns culture like this into cheap entertainment for dopamine, it becomes a commercial spectacle which replaces genuine play and art. Instead of play shaping culture, culture becomes a product itself. In Huizinga's age, he had to witness Nazi like spectacles and speeches where so many of his fellow citizens began to vindicate hate and rage while displaying parade like banners and flags littered with Christian symbolism, where everyone dressed up all in the same costume, uniform, and memorialized those that preached their dogmatic doctrine. Or could I just be explaining about America in the past year as well? What a coincidence is that? Wow, it's like the times never change. It's like history just repeats itself. That's crazy. Anyways, Politics has always utilized the play element by embodying a fierce competitive spirit. There are winners and there are losers. Everyone dresses in the same color to root for their team. And people used to be able to reconcile their differences with each other and didn't try to squash their opponents in complete domination. But nowadays, politics is so deeply corrupted because polarizing factions have dehumanized their opponents to the point that they don't even view them as their equals with different perspectives, but as bitter enemies and demons to be completely exterminated. Propaganda has spread like wildfire on social media at rapid speed, which has only further intensified the misinformation age we currently live in, while simultaneously eroding the boundaries between seriousness and play. And last but not least, democracy has become a mere spectacle we can only watch passively from our screens, without having any actual impact on the world as we watch tyrants twist the rules of the game to suit their needs right before our very eyes. This erosion of the play element in our society is deeply ironic because society arguably has more games than ever before, whether it be gambling, sports, hobbies, competitions, board games, video games, or shitty mobile games. The problem with this, however, is that these games do not possess the same spiritual or cultural depth that ritual play once had. These games and the sheer overwhelming amount of them are meant to drown out our external senses so that we don't have to listen to the deafening silence within. These games and the sheer overwhelming amount of them are meant to drown our external senses so that we don't have to listen to the deafening silence within. All these games are just empty activities that try to distract us from the void of nihilism that we have been too afraid to face collectively as a society. It is no coincidence that the rise of barbaric war and totalitarian ideologies arose around roughly the same time that Nietzsche's proclamation of the death of God was fully heard all around the world. As Christianity's influence began to wane in Western society post Enlightenment, people sought to fill that vacuum of meaning that God once filled with incessant utilitarian progress, extremist politics, or with hedonic materialism. Even though God isn't at the forefront of our minds anymore due to his non existence, that impact is still made fully known by all who feel emptiness and purposelessness inside. But how can we start to fill the God shaped hole in our souls that nihilism caused, but in healthier ways? Of course, I think the answer is play. Play can be the ultimate antidote towards the kind of nihilism that is slowly infecting every branch of modern society today. Although nihilism is one of the biggest issues humanity currently faces, in it also lies our solution. This is because there are two very different kinds of nihilism, and depending on your perspective, it can radically change your worldview. The first kind of nihilism that we see most notably today is what I like to call passive nihilism. This is the idea that nothing at all matters, and humanity is doomed to its own self extinction. In Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, Ivan Karamazov says famously, quote, "If there is no God, then all is permitted," end quote. If there is no God, then what is stopping me from living a drug fueled, money chasing, pleasure filled existence? If there is no meaning, then why try anything at all? If there's no purpose to all the world's suffering, then why even keep going? However, seeds of existential depression and violence are rooted in despair and sown in ideas like that. However, seeds of existential depression and violence rooted in despair are sown in ideas like this, and obviously are corrosive to the foundations of society. Passive nihilism has only exacerbated the macro crisis we are in with climate disasters, political corruption, and skyrocketing suicide rates. However, I think there's still hope. The second kind of nihilism is what Friedrich Nietzsche was actually an advocate for, despite the misconception that he himself was a hopeless nihilist that had no faith for humanity. Nietzsche is actually one of philosophy's biggest advocates for affirming life as it is. He advocated for what could be called active nihilism, which is essentially the idea that although there's no inherent meaning to the universe, we are the makers of our destiny. The world is our sandbox, and we are its programmers. We create value, meaning, and purpose in order to imbue it onto the external world to harmonize with our in. We can create value, meaning, and purpose in order to imbue it onto the external world in order to harmonize with our inner desires. Although all that we built, fought for, and endured in life will all eventually be washed away, we can find fulfillment in building the sandcastles we create and enjoy it while it lasts. So, how exactly can active nihilism counterbalance the effects passive nihilism has had on our culture? This is exactly where play comes into play. Huizinga writes that, quote, play lies outside the antithesis of wisdom and folly, and equally outside those of truth and falsehood, good and evil. Although it is a non material activity, it has no moral functions. The valuations of vice and virtue do not apply here. End quote. The foundation of Western society has been propped up on outdated traditions, established in moralistic dichotomies of good and evil, and without anything to fill the void that secular materialism has created, billions have been wandering around aimlessly and without purpose or direction. If society has been built on the values of good and evil, then how do we strive beyond that through play? If society has advanced through the mechanisms of play, according to Huizinga, then that must imply that our individual lives are like small games that contribute to the overall game of humanity. Our lives are one gigantic game we get to play in that's connected to an even larger game. There's no reason to go through life all glum and seriousness. When we open ourselves to the realm of play, we begin to perceive reality differently. Although there may be no teleological and objective purpose to existence, that doesn't matter if we view all of life as play. Just like how Mario has the quest to rescue Princess Peach, or one has to survive Fortnite's storm the longest, every game has an aim and overall purpose. In Twilight of the Idols, Friedrich Nietzsche claimed that his formula for happiness was, quote, a yes, a no, a straight line, a goal, end quote. The game of life doesn't require God to be the referee, but rather we can create the goals we want to work towards. If we can give ourselves goals and quests to pursue, happiness or eudaimonia will await us. But how do we know what goals to strive after when there are a myriad of forces striving to steal our attention and time away from us? Now, this is where the fun really begins. The best way to gain this perspective is by sensitizing oneself to the desires of our inner child. Reconnecting with our inner child again allows us to tap into the dreams and intuitions that guided our creativity when we were just infants. But what is the inner child exactly? And how does it differ from the general therapy speak we see sprawled all over the internet today? Generally, in modern psychology, the inner child is often conceived as a semi independent subpersonality subordinate to the waking conscious mind. The concept of the inner child traces back to Carl Jung's book Archetypes in the Collective Unconscious. Although Carl Jung didn't call this part of ourselves an inner child, he called it the divine child archetype, which he saw as a universal symbol of spiritual renewal and vivifying transformation that lies in us all. Jung recognized that there are hidden undercurrents of behavior in our unconscious minds that are fundamentally irrational, but often leads us towards healing and growth. Oftentimes, these behavioral patterns are reminiscent of childlike qualities such as innocence, spontaneity, and creativity. However, the concept of this inner or divine child isn't a recent development in psychology, but actually has a long history throughout philosophy as well. Similar to Jung, Plato split the soul, which is translated as psyche in the Greek, into different parts which can be impulsive, irrational, or yearning for joy. Spiritual and mystical traditions talk about the necessity of having a childlike perspective of the world, which remains continuously open, unfiltered, and inherently curious. Jesus once again said we have to become like little children. Rumi wants us to shed the ego and return to the beginner's heart. In later times, Rousseau developed this idea even further in his book Emile. Or Emily? Emile? Emily? Whatever, one of the two. Rousseau argued that children have a natural goodness which society corrupts, which would later influence his political views of society as a whole, being the main mechanism which corrupts the individual, and that societal and individual growth means returning to that original inner core. Perhaps the most important philosophical development came yet again from Nietzsche's discussion of human development, which massively influenced Carl Jung in his later studies. In his book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche provides modernity with one of its first models of human development, the three metamorphoses. Nietzsche claims that the human spirit goes through three pivotal symbolical transformations in its life. The first is the camel, then the lion, and finally, the child. The camel is the stage of development in which our spirit or soul yearns for a higher purpose and is ready to reform itself out of reverence for its ideal. Like a camel that is ready to be loaded with heavy weight before it plunges deep into the desert, so too do our spirits want to bear the weight of our unique purpose with ravenous tenacity. When we transfigure into the camel, our soul yearns to aim for something larger than itself, and will willingly challenge itself to accomplish this. The spirit bears its humps gladly, it bears its weight gladly, as it strives to live with the, quote, weighty spirit, in Nietzsche's words. The camel willingly disciplines itself with commandments, expectations, and Tao shouts. When one wants to relieve themselves of this heaviness, the lion arises from within and reclaims his inner power. With newfound inner authority, the lion rebels against its societal conditioning and breaks its chains it was once binded to. The lion fights back against the traumas it had to endure and has the courage to stand up for itself assertively and roars loudly with a sacred no. The lion has no time to listen to internalized voices like, you can't do that or don't be cringe. It is no longer ruled by thou shouts, but thou will. However, the lion only destroys what is in its way and is incapable of building something out of its wreckage. This is where the child comes into play. Once the lion has broken free of its bondage, the child takes its place and affirms all of life with a sacred and divine yes. It is only a yes sayer. The child now has the creativity and spontaneity to create its own world of meaning, its own world of purpose. The child is not infantile, but rather the essence of creation incarnate. The child trusts its inner experience over man made ideologies or external demands. It is motivated by personal meaning rather than a deontological sense of duty and obligation. Nietzsche's child isn't about returning back to the safety and comfort of childhood, but rather is about becoming someone who can finally live with the freedom, imagination, and playfulness we lost on the way to adulthood. It's the child you become after you face the world, not before. So once we cultivate this childlike attitude towards the world, how can we start to make our own meaning through play whilst being active nihilist? As our inner child and intuition is restored, we grow to become more spontaneous, receptive, and open to the possibilities the world lays before us. And this is the natural state that genuine play arises in us. We grow to understand what we truly desire in life, no matter how far fetched or childlike the dreams may be. Not being dragged to the extremes of rationality and impulsivity, our hearts or heart minds, as the Confucians like to put it, begin to guide our way in life, and new opportunities and experiences unfold naturally. Sometimes these opportunities and experiences shake us out of our normal mode of being, that we can't not but imbue meaning and significance behind it. Living life playfully in this way actually shares some connections with Carl Jung's concept of synchronicity, which is the idea that some events are not connected causally, but rather meaningfully. If life is a kind of play, synchronicity is how the game communicates meaning and guides us as to where our heart mind is tugging us towards. Now, I know the concept of synchronicity is hotly debated nowadays due to its lack of empirical support backing up its claims, and the fact that our brains are pattern recognition machines that can find meaning literally behind any coincidence whatsoever. Now, I know the concept of synchronicity is hotly debated nowadays due to its lack of empirical support backing up its claims, and the fact that our brains are pattern recognition machines that can find meaning literally behind any coincidence whatsoever. That could be a whole podcast episode in and of itself, which we don't have time to go into today. But I really don't think it matters if synchronicity truly exists or not if you feel it is tugging you in the direction of your fullest potential and isn't negatively affecting you or those around you. Returning to our inner child and adopting a playful attitude towards life means you have the capability of making life an experiment in which you are the scientist with endless curiosity. Behave as if synchronicity is real, and then behave as if it isn't. Or don't. See how it impacts your life just for the hell of it, and by the end of it, see where it takes you. If you decide to experiment in this way and come to believe that synchronicity has some credence behind it, sometimes synchronicities will arise where you are forced to do something that you really don't want to do, but deep down you know you have to in order to keep your authenticity intact, even though it could cause distress in your life. When this happens, it is like life is trying to challenge us by providing just enough friction to grow and keep persevering. For example, after I graduated from college, I was working in a pretty dead end job where I saw no future in it whatsoever, but it paid the bills comfortably. However, the longer that I worked there, the more I saw my potential wasting away. And I simply refused to make that happen because I desperately wanted to grow and to try and have a better impact on the world. But for a while, I hesitated because I was scared to take that leap of faith necessary to live life in a more playful way. It was ironically around this same time that I learned about the concept of synchronicity, and I saw it guiding me in my life away from my lifeless job and into something more adventurous and attuned to my inner being. This is how Joseph Campbell viewed life, the 20th century's most influential mythologist and dear friend of Carl Jung, George Lucas, and John Steinbeck. Campbell was once asked in an interview, "Do you ever have this sense of being helped by hidden hands?" And Campbell replied, "All the time. It is miraculous. I even have a superstition that has grown on me as a result of invisible hands coming all the time. Namely, that if you do follow your bliss, you put yourself on a kind of track that has been there all the while, waiting for you. And the life that you ought to be living is the one you are living. When you can see that, you begin to meet people who are in your field of bliss, and they open doors to you. I say, follow your bliss and don't be afraid. And doors will open where you didn't know where they were going to be." End quote. When we follow our natural and unclouded desires, we are better able to live in harmony with ourselves and the world around us. It is when we follow our bliss that we are able to guide and navigate ourselves in our meaningless world and transform our personal world into one of meaning making. Returning to the inner child and following our bliss is one way that we can live as active nihilists. The phrase "follow your bliss" is pretty mainstream in our culture today, especially since the hippie revolution of the 60s and 70s. However, people have misinterpreted it to mean baseless, mindless, hedonic pleasure, and this couldn't be further from the case. Nothing worth doing in life is easy. Friedrich Nietzsche would say that the amount of joy and meaning we are able to experience in this life is directly proportional to how much pain and suffering you are able to endure. Hiking to the top of a mountain is painful, but reaching the summit makes all the pain worth it in the end. And the joy and the pride you feel for self overcoming your challenges is unmatched. One of the first mountaineers to try and summit Mount Everest, over a century ago now, George Mallory, he was once asked why the hell he would attempt such a feat, which would eventually claim his life. His response was simple, quote, "Because it is there," end quote. Even though summiting Everest is one of the most challenging tasks any human can accomplish, Mallory was determined to attempt it because of its inherent thrill of mountaineering. Mallory was following his bliss because he was driven by an inherent human desire to push boundaries and to seek adventure, which is universal in us all. If following your bliss doesn't involve you getting out of your comfort zone, questioning if you're nuts, or doesn't even have you taking any risks, then is it truly meaningful in the end? In a sense, this is how we level up in life. We look at the biggest obstacle currently in our lives and we try to figure out how to overcome it, despite it being a never ending process of self mastery and growth. Those who see life as a game inevitably see all challenges as such, just a bunch of games to complete, and they become obsessive in trying to overcome them. They willingly take on things that will force them to grow and get out of their comfort zone. All genuine play involves some risk of failure in order to make the game exciting. And so, a playful life must be built on the slopes of Vesuvius, like Nietzsche proclaimed when he said that, quote, "The secret for harvesting from existence the greatest fruitfulness and the greatest enjoyment is to live dangerously," end quote. This isn't a call to recklessness, though. It is a call to seek meaning and growth out of suffering. Think about the power play, but sorry, that was cringe. But we embrace cringe on this channel. This is a cringe affirming channel right here on the Philos-Hippie Podcast. But anyways, think about the power play one engages on reality when we embrace suffering with a smiling spirit and have the strength to co-opt its pain in order to will it to our own purposes of inner growth and abundance. With this attitude in mind, the quest for self-mastery is one of the greatest games one can play in life that we can all partake in. And of course, the game will look different for every individual. There is no one-size-fits-all solution to address the meaninglessness of our existence. So you have to try and figure out what works for you and what doesn't. Personally, I really resonate with trying to embody the archetypal ideal of Nietzsche's Overman, or the Renaissance humanist that is a jack of all trades in all the arts and sciences. I like these ideals because they inspire me to be the best version of myself I can possibly be, and it's also a game I can always try and level up in and progress. But of course, finding what clicks for you could be as silly and simple as making funny memes online and trying to spread as much laughter and joy as you can to your friends and family. Or it could be as disciplined and structured as trying to win the Olympic Games, or trying to become a successful author. Or it could be none of those things. Fuck it all. Your heart and inner intuition, as cliche as it sounds, will guide you where you need to go. You just have to take the leap of faith and be ready to embrace life in all its glory. Okay, this all sounds fine and dandy for the individual self, but what about society as a whole? What is the point of self mastery and leveling up in life if there's no one else around to play with because we're all scorched to death from climate change? According to James P. Carse, who was an American academic and professor emeritus of history and literature of religion at New York University, argued in his groundbreaking book, Finite and Infinite Games, that there are only two kinds of games on Earth, namely, finite and infinite games. A finite game is played to win, which has clear rules, boundaries, winners, losers, and a definite beginning and end. Examples could be sports, video games, contests, war, elections, and so on. Players seek victory in order to have fun, to inflate their ego, defeat their ops, and thrive on the structure and predictability that comes from the game. An infinite game, on the other hand, has only one objective: to keep playing the game indefinitely. Its goal is not winning, but done for the sake of itself. There is no time limit to an infinite game, no boundaries, no winners or losers, and no dogmatic rules that can't be changed so that the game can continually evolve and adapt to the culture's current needs and wants. Infinite games could range from art, love, science, the pursuit of knowledge, culture, spirituality, but most importantly, life itself. We are not born to win life, but are given the chance to participate in it, to stamp our own unique mark on the world, and hopefully leave the world behind a more vibrant and diverse place. One of James Carse's most interesting points in the book is his definitions of society and culture. These terms always get used interchangeably, and I make that mistake myself sometimes too. Carse proposes that society is, quote, the sum of relations that are under some form of public constraint, end quote. Society concerns itself with the upkeep and preservation of established roles, rules, institutions, and titles. You may have been told by your parents or teachers to get a job that pays well and is prestigious like a doctor or lawyer. Not because it would be a good fit for you personally, but because it will provide you security and also help preserve the status quo. Carse then provides contrast to society by claiming that culture is simply, quote, whatever we do with each other by undirected choice, end quote. In essence, society is the hardware of humanity, and culture is its software. There is a constant push and pull between society and culture, which is continually evolving. However, Carse would argue that society currently has a stranglehold on culture. However, Carse would argue that society currently has a stranglehold on culture. It is obvious today that our educational and legal institutions have little to no care or regard for the humanities or culture in general. Our utilitarian obsessed society is solely concerned with efficiency and statistics. It's no wonder that it seems our culture has been on a perpetual downward slope since 2016, as brain rot and misinformation has imprisoned our hearts and minds. The algorithm designers don't care if the art and media we consume is edifying for the soul, or if it inspires us to recreate ourselves in the world we live in. They only care about numbers, statistics, clicks, and follows. This obsession with external results has terrible side effects for the state of our culture. If society only cares about keeping the status quo intact and enforcing tradition, then where does that leave place for breaking the boundaries and expanding ourselves into something rich and creative? But how can we combat this? I mean, we have been a consumer culture for so long. So how can we transform ourselves into a creator culture? This can take form in a plethora of ways. First and foremost, we need to push back against the domineering control that society has in our creative lives. We need to fight back against society with culture. We need to prioritize freedom over victory. Finite players in society are heavily concerned with their identities because they attach their sense of self to their accomplishments instead of freely participating in the game of life collectively. The more a society opens itself up to cultural renewal, the more playful it becomes. Institutions can become playful when they stop pretending that they are absolute and recognize that there are many ways of organizing human action. A playful society is one that lets culture keep reshaping itself, instead of clinging to the illusion of permanence and floating in stagnancy. So, what does this all look like practically in the real world? On the individual level, it requires a commitment by humans to create more than they consume, to fully unleash their inner child, as talked about previously, onto the world. Even if you aren't artistically inclined, it doesn't matter. You are human, and your life itself can be a masterpiece of art. I'm pretty sure I've quoted this in prior episodes, but it's one of my favorites ever. Nietzsche once famously asserted that, quote, art is the proper task of life. One must give value to their existence by behaving as if one's very existence were a work of art, end quote. One can live out their life as the ultimate creative act by not conforming to societal standards, and in so doing, inspire others to break out of their patterns and to live more authentically and compassionately. Being a creator doesn't mean you always have to manifest tangible works. It can also just mean thinking originally, paving the way for visionary ideals to come to life. Or being a creator could look like you trying to break people out of their ingrained modes of thinking and to wake them up to something beautiful. Living a creative life in this way empowers oneself as well, because late stage capitalism can co opt your life and turn it into mindless profit, unlike tangible creative acts like a Banksy mural or Nirvana's music, for example. But even if your artwork does get co opted by the machinations of profit, it shouldn't ultimately matter to you because you have brought new life into the world, even if it inspires only just one person. On the societal level, it requires an awareness that we must all come together if we want to keep the infinite game of life going. This requires cultivating an ethic of intergenerationality and having greater balance between culture and society. One of my favorite historical examples of this comes from the secular Confucian system of ancient China. According to Robert Ames, a Confucian scholar, people are understood not as individuals, but solely as, quote, persons in relations, embedded in networks of the connection across space and time. In order to be a civil servant back then, Chinese officials were required to master civil service examinations, where they tested their knowledge of the Confucian classics like the Analects, the Book of Changes, and the teachings of Mencius. One had to possess cultural knowledge before they were allowed to shape and guide society in the realm of politics. And it's pretty safe to say that our politics today has none of these characteristics whatsoever. And I think it would be prudent of our politicians to demonstrate more cultural competency, instead of having a sitting president share AI slop of himself literally shitting on his own US citizens in a fighter jet. Like, seriously, what the fuck, bro? The Western equivalent of what this would look like for our political leaders is them being required to read, I don't know, the Platonic dialogues and other classics in antiquity, or other modern classics in literature, in order to take up civil office. Imagine what our nation would look like if our leaders acquired a more holistic and varied education, rather than literally half a Congress being filled with people with either law or business degrees. Our politicians are leading the nation with such a limited perspective of reality. It is the reason why they're so tone deaf and don't abide by the will of the people. In the 21st century, culture is often sacrificed for the sake of technological progress, but it doesn't have to be that way. One of my favorite historical examples where the play element was the foundation for scientific and cultural progress was with the space race of the 1960s. Even though the space race was performed by the greatest superpowers in the world, trying to gain the upper hand over the other, it was founded on competition, which is one of the crucial elements for play to arise within culture. As opposed to today, where everything is controlled by monopolies and there is simply no competition whatsoever. The Soviet and American race to space provided just the right amount of friction for profound societal growth. And we can rekindle that spark today with new challenges and competitions society can engage in as a whole. One of JFK's most famous quotes is that we choose to go to the moon and do other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. This simple quote is emblematic of the play element and also the human condition in general. It is in our nature to challenge ourselves, so that we may rise into something more expansive than what came before, which is born out of a desire not for dominion, but lighthearted playfulness and fun. This means to say to yourself when approaching a mountain trailhead not, can I conquer this mountain, but instead, what surprises lay in store for me at the mountaintop? So, if there's one thing to take away from today's episode, it's this. The world doesn't need more people crushed beneath the weight of seriousness. It needs people who can remember how to play. Not in the superficial escapist sense that modern pseudo-play offers us, but in the deep, life-affirming way Huizinga, Nietzsche, and Jung, and so many other spiritual traditions understood it, as the creative, meaning-making pulse at the heart of being human. We are living through heavy times, politically, ecologically, psychologically, and yet, as strange as it sounds, the antidote to the paralysis of passive nihilism might not be found in doubling down on grim determination, but in rediscovering the inner capacities that children embody naturally: curiosity, imagination, spontaneity, and joy. Because these aren't childish traits. They are the raw materials of culture itself, the birthplace of meaning, and the foundation of every world we've ever built together. When we approach life as an infinite game, rather than a finite battle, the goal stops being domination or survival and becomes continuation, growth, creativity, and relationship. We stop asking what's the point and start asking what can I create next? Active nihilism invites us to embrace that freedom. The inner child shows us how, and play gives us the tools. If synchronicity exists, perhaps it's the game nudging us toward the next quest. And if it doesn't, then we are the ones placing those breadcrumbs on the path. But either way, walking it with curiosity beats standing still in despair. Joseph Campbell's reminder to follow your bliss isn't about hedonism or naive optimism. It's about turning your life to the frequency of authenticity, where meaning arises not because the universe hands it to you, but because you're bold enough to create it yourself. Naturally, when you follow your bliss, the fruits of that will bleed over into the lives of those in your community. When we collectively realize that we are not playing a first-person video game, but a vast, expansive sandbox with other playable characters, our society can loosen its stranglehold on the culture as we try to imagine and enact a new world aligned with our playful natures. Humanity can only begin to thrive when we act as if life is an infinite rather than finite game. So, as we wrap up, I invite you to experiment with your own life as if it were a kind of sacred play. Reconnect with the inner child you abandoned on the way to adulthood. Let that child guide you toward the goals that feel alive, not the ones imposed by fear or obligation. Thank you so much for making it to the end of this video and for listening to the Philos-Hippie Podcast. If you enjoyed this exploration, consider sharing it with someone who might need a reminder that life is still, and always has been, a game worth playing. I know this episode already had a lot of ideas and books referenced in it. I didn't even get to use all the research I did because this episode was getting to be too long. So if you like this topic of how play arises in culture or reality in general, let me know. I didn't want to dive into any metaphysics in this episode since I was mostly dealing with the topic of how play can address nihilism in our tangible lives. So, if you want me to get more theoretical, abstract, and metaphysical with the philosophy of play, let me know, and I would love to do a deeper dive on this topic someday. Until next time, stay curious, stay playful, and let's keep this infinite game going. In the meantime, I wish you well and I wish you wisdom. Peace.